Conclusion, Part 2 of Clarissa Harlowe, or The History of a Young Lady, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Nicole Lee. Clarissa Harlowe, or The History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson. Conclusion, Part 2. Postscript referred to in the preface, in which several objections that have been made, as well to the catastrophe as to different parts of the preceding history, are briefly considered. The foregoing work having been published at 3 different periods of time, the author in the course of its publication was favoured with many anonymous letters, in which the writers differently expressed their wishes with regard to the apprehended catastrophe. Most of those directed to him by the gentler sex turned in favour of what they called a fortunate ending. Some of the fair writers, enamoured, as they declared, with the character of the heroine, were warmly solicitous to have her made happy; and others, likewise of their mind, insisted that poetical justice required that it should be so. And when, says one ingenious lady, whose undoubted motive was good nature and humanity, it must be concluded that it is in an author's power to make his piece end as he pleases, why should he not give pleasure rather than pain to the reader whom he has interested in favour of his principal characters? Others, and some gentlemen, declared against tragedies in general, and in favour of comedies, almost in the words of Lovelace, who was supported in his taste by all the women at Mrs. Sinclair's, and by Sinclair herself. I have too much feeling, said he. There is enough in the world to make our hearts sad, without carrying grief into our diversions, and making the distresses of others our own. And how was this happy ending to be brought about? Why, by this very easy and trite expedient, to wit, by reforming Lovelace, and marrying him to Clarissa; not, however, abating her one of her trials, nor any of her sufferings, for the sake of the sport her distresses would give to the tender-hearted reader as she went along, the last outrage excepted, that, indeed partly in compliment to Lovelace himself, and partly for her delicacy's sake, they were willing to spare her. But whatever were the fate of his work, the author was resolved to take a different method. He always thought that sudden conversions, such, especially, as were left to the candour of the reader to suppose and make out, has neither art, nor nature, nor even probability in them, and that they were moreover of a very bad example. To have a Lovelace, for a series of years, glory in his wickedness, and think that he had nothing to do, but as an act of grace and favour, to hold out his hand, to receive that of the best of women, whenever he pleased, and to have it thought that marriage would be a sufficient amends for all his enormities to others as well as to her, he could not bear that. Nor is reformation, as he has shown in another piece, to be secured by a fine face, by a passion that has sense for its object, nor by the goodness of a wife's heart, nor even example, if the heart of the husband be not graciously touched by the divine finger. It will be seen by this time that the author had a great end in view. He had lived to see the scepticism and infidelity openly avowed, and even endeavoured to be propagated from the press; the greatest doctrines of the gospel brought into question; those of self-denial and mortification blotted out of the catalogue of Christian virtues; and a taste even to wantonness for out-door pleasure and luxury, to the general exclusion of domestic as well as public virtue, industriously promoted among all ranks and degrees of people. In this general depravity, when even the pulpit has lost great part of its weight, and the clergy are considered as a body of interested men, the author thought he should be able to answer it to his own heart, be the success what it would, if he threw in his mite towards introducing a reformation so much wanted; and he imagined, that if in an age given up to diversion and entertainment, if he could steal in, as may be said, and investigate the great doctrines of Christianity under the fashionable guise of an amusement, he should be most likely to serve his purpose, remembering that of the poet: a verse may find him who a sermon flies, and turn delight into a sacrifice. He was resolved, therefore, to attempt something that never yet had been done. He considered that the tragic poets have as seldom made their heroes true objects of pity, as the comics theirs laudable ones of imitation, and still more rarely have made them in their deaths look forward to a future hope. And thus when they die they seem totally to perish. Death in such instances must appear terrible. It must be considered as the greatest evil. But why is death set in such shocking lights, when it is the universal lot? He has indeed thought fit to paint the death of the wicked as terrible as he could paint it. But he has endeavoured to draw that of the good in such an amiable manner, that the very Balaams of the world should not forbear to wish that their latter end might be like that of the heroine. And after all, what is the poetical justice so much contended for by some, as the generality of writers have managed it, but another sort of dispensation than that with which God by revelation teaches us he has thought fit to exercise mankind, whom placing here only in a state of probation, he hath so intermingled good and evil, as to necessitate us to look forward for a more equal dispensation of both. The author of the history, or rather dramatic narrative, of Clarissa is therefore well justified by the Christian system, in deferring to extricate suffering virtue to the time in which it will meet with the completion of its reward. But not absolutely to shelter the conduct observed in it under the sanction of religion, an authority perhaps not of the greatest weight with some of our modern critics, it must be observed that the author is justified in its catastrophe by the greatest master of reason and best judge of composition that ever lived. The learned reader knows we must mean Aristotle, whose sentiments in this matter we shall beg leave to deliver in the words of a very amiable writer of our own country. The English writers of tragedy, says Mr. Addison, are possessed with a notion that when they represent a virtuous or innocent person in distress, they ought not to leave him till they have delivered him out of his troubles, or made him triumph over his enemies. This error they have been led into by a ridiculous doctrine in modern criticism, that they are obliged to an equal distribution of rewards and punishments, and an impartial execution of poetical justice. Who were the first that established this rule, I know not, but I am sure it has no foundation in nature, in reason, or in the practice of the ancients. We find that good and evil happen alike unto all men on this side the grave; and as the principal design of tragedy is to raise commiseration and terror in the minds of the audience, we shall defeat this great end, if we always make virtue and innocence happy and successful. Whatever crosses and disappoints a good man suffers in the body of the tragedy, they will make but small impression on our minds, when we know that in the last act he is to arrive at the end of his wishes and desires. When we see him engaged in the depth of his afflictions, we are apt to comfort ourselves, because we are sure he will find his way out of them, and that his grief, however great soever it may be at present, will soon terminate in gladness. For this reason, the ancient writers of tragedy treated men in their plays, as they are dealt with in the world, by making virtue sometimes happy and sometimes miserable, as they found it in the fable which they made choice of, or as it might affect their audience in the most agreeable manner. Aristotle considers the tragedies that were written in either of those kinds, and observes, that those which ended unhappily had always pleased the people, and carried away the prize, in the public disputes of the state, from those that ended happily. Terror and commiseration leave a pleasing anguish in the mind, and fix the audience in such a serious composure of thought, as is much more lasting and delightful than any little transient starts of joy and satisfaction. Accordingly we find, that more of our English tragedies have succeeded, in which the favourites of the audience sink under their calamities, than those in which they recover themselves out of them. The best plays of this kind are The Orphan, Venice Preserved, Alexander the Great, Theodosius, All for Love, Oedipus, Oronoku, Othello, etc. King Lear is an admirable tragedy of the same kind, as Shakespeare wrote it, but as it is reformed, according to the chimerical notion of poetical justice, in my humble opinion it has lost half its beauty. At the same time I must allow, that there are very noble tragedies which have been framed upon the other plan, and have ended happily, as indeed most of the good tragedies which have been written since the starting of the above-mentioned criticism have taken this turn. The Mourning Bride, Tamerlane, Ulysses, Phaedra and Hippolytus, with most of Mr. Dryden's. I must also allow that many of Shakespeare's and several of the celebrated tragedies of antiquity are cast in the same form. I do not therefore dispute against this way of writing tragedies, but against the criticism that would establish this as the only method, and by that means would very much cramp the English tragedy, and perhaps give a wrong bent to the genius of our writers. This subject is further considered in a letter to the Spectator. I find your opinion, says the author of it, concerning the late invented term called poetical justice, is controverted by some eminent critics. I have drawn up some additional arguments to strengthen the opinion which you have there delivered, having endeavoured to go to the bottom of that matter. The most perfect man has vices enough to draw down punishments upon his head, and to justify Providence in regard to any miseries that may befall him. For this reason I cannot but think that the instruction and moral are much finer, where a man who is virtuous in the main of his character falls into distress, and sinks under the blows of fortune, at the end of a tragedy, than when he is represented as happy and triumphant. Such an example corrects the insolence of human nature, softens the mind of the beholder with sentiments of pity and compassion, comforts him under his own private affliction, and teaches him not to judge of men's virtues by their successes. I cannot think of one real hero in all antiquity so far raised above human infirmities, that he might not be very naturally represented in a tragedy as plunged in misfortunes and calamities. The poet may still find out some prevailing passion or indiscretion in his character, and show it in such a manner as will sufficiently acquit Providence of any injustice in his sufferings. For, as Horace observes, the best man is faulty, though not in so great a degree as those whom we generally call vicious men. If such a strict poetical justice, proceeds the letter writer, as some gentlemen insist upon, were to be observed in this art, there is no manner of reason why it should not be so little observed in Homer, that his Achilles is placed in the greatest point of glory and success, though his character is morally vicious and only poetically good, if I may use the phrase of our modern critics. The Aeneid is filled with innocent unhappy persons. Nisus and Euryalus, Lausus and Pallas, come all to unfortunate ends. The poet takes notice in particular, that in the sacking of Troy, Ripheus fell, who was the most just character among the Trojans. Cedit et Ripheus, justissimus unus, qui fuit in Teucris, et servantissimus aequi, dies aliter visum est. The gods thought fit, so blameless Ripheus fell, who loved fair justice, and observed it well. And that Pantheus could neither be preserved by his transcendent piety, nor by the holy fillets of Apollo, whose priest he was. Nec te tua plurima, Pantheu, labentum pietas, nec Apollonis infula texit. Nor could thy piety thee, Pantheus, save, nor e'en thy priesthood from an early grave. I might here mention the practice of ancient tragic poets, both Greek and Latin. But as this particular is touched upon in the paper above mentioned, I shall pass it over in silence. I could produce passages out of Aristotle in favour of my opinion, and if in one place he says, that an absolutely virtuous man should not be represented as unhappy, this does not justify any one who should think fit to bring in an absolutely virtuous man upon the stage. Those who are acquainted with that author's way of writing know very well, that to take the whole extent of his subject into his divisions of it, he often makes use of such cases as are imaginary, and not reducible to practice. I shall conclude, says this gentleman, with observing, that though the Spectator above mentioned is so far against the rule of poetical justice as to affirm, that good men may meet with an unhappy catastrophe in tragedy, it does not say, that ill men may go off unpunished. The reason for this distinction is very plain, namely, because the best of men, as is said above, have faults enough to justify Providence for any misfortunes and afflictions which may befall them, but there are many men so criminal, that they can have no claim or pretence to happiness. The best of men may deserve punishment, but the worst of men cannot deserve happiness. Mr. Addison, as we have seen above, tells us, that Aristotle, in considering the tragedies that were written in either of the kinds, observes, that those which ended unhappily had always pleased the people, and carried away the prize, in the public disputes of the stage, from those that ended happily. And we shall take leave to add, that this preference was given at a time when the entertainments of the stage were committed to the care of the magistrates, when the prizes contended for were given by the state, when, of consequence, the emulation among writers was ardent, and when learning was at the highest pitch of glory in that renowned commonwealth. It cannot be supposed that the Athenians, in this their highest age of taste and politeness, were less humane, less tender-hearted, than we of the present; but they were not afraid of being moved, nor ashamed of showing themselves to be so, at the distresses they saw well painted and represented. In short, they were of the opinion, with the wisest of men, that it was better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of mirth, and had fortitude enough to trust themselves with their own generous grief, because they found their hearts mended by it. Thus also Horace, and the politest Romans in the Augustan age, wished to be affected. Ac ne forte putes me, quae facere ipse recusam, cum recte tractant alii, laudere maligne. Ille per extentum funem mihi posse videtur, ire poeta, meum qui pectus in anita angit, irritat, mulcet, falsis terroribus implet, ut majus, et modo me Thebis, modo poent Athenis. Thus Englished by Mr. Pope. Yet, lest thou think I rally more than teach, or praise malignly arts I cannot reach, let me for once presume to instruct the times, to know the poet from the man of rhymes. 'Tis he who gives my breast 1,000 pains, can make me feel each passion that he feigns, and rage compose with more than magic art, with pity and with terror tear my heart, and snatch me o'er the earth or through the air, to Thebes, to Athens, when he will, and where. Our fair readers are also desired to attend to what a celebrated critic of a neighbouring nation says on the nature and design of tragedy, from the rules laid down by the same great ancient. Rapin, on Aristotle's Poetics. Tragedy, says he, makes man modest, by representing the great masters of the earth humbled; and it makes him tender and merciful, by showing him the strange accidents of life, and the unforeseen disgraces to which the most important persons are subject. But because man is naturally timorous and compassionate, he may fall into other extremes. Too much fear may shake his constancy of mind, and too much of tragedy to regulate these two weaknesses. It prepares and arms him against disgraces by showing them so frequent in the most considerable persons, and he will cease to fear extraordinary accidents when he sees them happen to the highest part of mankind. And still more efficacious, we may add, the example will be, when he sees them happen to the best. But as the end of tragedy is to teach men not to fear too weakly common misfortunes, it proposes also to teach them to spare their compassion for objects that deserve it. For there is an injustice in being moved at the afflictions of those who deserve to be miserable. We may see without pity Clytemnestra slain by her son Orestes in Aeschylus, because she had murdered Agamemnon her husband. Yet we cannot see Hippolytus die by the plot of his stepmother Phaedra in Euripides without compassion, because he died not but for being chaste and virtuous. These are the great authorities so favourable to the stories that end unhappily, and we beg leave to reinforce this inference from them, that if the temporary sufferings of the virtuous and the good can be accounted for and justified on pagan principles, many more and infinitely stronger reasons will occur to a Christian reader in behalf of what are called unhappy catastrophes, from the consideration of the doctrine of future rewards, which is everywhere strongly enforced in the history of Clarissa. Of this, to give but one instance, an ingenious modern, distinguished by his rank, but much more for his excellent defence of some of the most important doctrines of Christianity, appears convinced in the conclusion of a pathetic monody lately published, in which, after he had deplored as a man without hope, expressing ourselves in the Scripture phrase, the loss of an excellent wife, he thus consoles himself: Yet, O my soul, thy rising murmurs stay, nor dare the all-wise disposer to arraign, or against his supreme decree, with impious grief complain. That all thy full-blown joys at once should fade, was his most righteous will, and be that will obeyed. Would thy fond love his grace to her control, and in these low abodes of sin and pain, her pure exalted soul unjustly for thy partial good detain? No, rather strive thy grovelling mind to raise up to that unclouded blaze, that heavenly radiance of eternal light, in which enthroned she now with pity sees how frail, how insecure, how slight is every mortal bliss. But of infinitely greater weight than all that has been above produced on this subject are the words of the Psalmist. As for me, says he, my feet were almost gone, my steps had well nigh slipped, for I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, for their strength is firm, they are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Their eyes stand out with fatness, they have more than their heart could wish. Verily I have cleansed mine heart in vain, and washed my hands in innocence, for all the day long have I been plagued and chastened every morning. When I thought to know this, it was too painful for me, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then understood I their end. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterwards receive me to glory. This is the psalmist's comfort and dependence. And shall man, presuming to alter the common course of nature, and so far as he is able, to elude the tenure by which frail mortality indispensably holds, imagine that he can make a better dispensation, and by calling it poetical justice, indirectly reflect on the divine? The more pains have been taken to obviate the objections arising from the notion of poetical justice, as the doctrine built upon it had obtained general credit among us, and as it must be confessed to have the appearance of humanity and good nature for its supports. And yet the writer of the History of Clarissa is humbly of opinion that he might have been excused referring to them for the vindication of his catastrophe, even by those who are advocates for the contrary opinion, since the notion of poetical justice, founded on the modern rules, has hardly ever been more strictly observed in works of this nature than in the present performance. For is not Mr. Lovelace, who could persevere in his villanous views against the strongest and most frequent convictions and remorses that ever were sent to awaken and reclaim a wicked man, is not this great, this wilful transgressor condignly punished, and his punishment brought on through the intelligence of the very Joseph Leman whom he had corrupted, and by means of the very woman whom he had debauched? Is not Mr. Belton, who had an uncle's hastened death to answer for? Are not the infamous Sinclair and her wretched partners, and even the wicked servants, who with their eyes open contributed their parts to the carrying on of the vile schemes of their respective principals, are they not all likewise exemplarily punished? On the other hand, is not Miss Howe, for her noble friendship to the exalted lady in her calamities? Is not Mr. Hickman, for his unexceptionable morals and integrity of life? Is not the repentant and not ungenerous Belford? Is not the worthy Norton made signally happy? And who that are in earnest in their professions of Christianity, but will rather envy than regret the triumphant death of Clarissa, whose piety from her early childhood, whose diffusive charity, whose steady virtue, whose Christian humility, whose forgiving spirit, whose meekness and resignation, Heaven only could reward? And here it may not be amiss to remind the reader, that so early in the work as Vol. II. Letter 38, the dispensations of Providence are justified by herself. And thus she ends her reflections: I shall not live always. May my closing scene be happy. She had her wish. It was happy. We shall now, according to the expectation given in the preface to this edition, proceed to take brief notice of such other objections as have come to our knowledge; for, as is there said, this work being addressed to the public as a history of life and manners, those parts of it which are proposed to carry with them the force of example ought to be as unobjectionable as is consistent with the design of the whole, and with human nature. Several persons have censured the heroine as too cold in her love, too haughty, and even sometimes provoking. But we may presume to say, that this objection has arisen from want of attention to the story, to the character of Clarissa, and to her particular situation. It was not intended that she should be in love, but in liking only, if that expression may be admitted. It is meant to be every where inculcated in the story for example's sake, that she never would have married Mr. Lovelace, because of his immoralities, had she been left to herself; and that of her ruin was principally owing to the persecutions of her friends. What is too generally called love ought, perhaps as generally, to be called by another name: cupidity, or a Paphian stimulus, as some women, even of condition, have acted, are not words too harsh to be substituted on the occasion, however grating they may be to delicate ears. But take the word love in the gentlest and most honourable sense, it would have been thought by some highly improbable, that Clarissa should have been able to show such a command of her passions, as makes so distinguishing a part of her character, had she been as violently in love, as certain warm and fierce spirits would have had her to be. A few observations are thrown in by way of note in the present edition, at proper places to obviate this objection, or rather to bespeak the attention of hasty readers to what lies obviously before them. For thus the heroine anticipates this very objection, expostulating with Miss Howe on her contemptuous treatment of Mr. Hickman, which, far from being guilty of the same fault herself, she did on all occasions, and declares she would do so, whenever Miss Howe forgot herself, although she had not a day to live. O my dear, says she, that it had been my lot, as I was not permitted to live single, to have met with a man by whom I could have acted generously and unreservedly. Mr. Lovelace, it is now plain, in order to have a pretence against me, taxed my behaviour to him with stiffness and distance. You, at one time, thought me guilty of some degree of prudery. Difficult situations should be allowed for, which often make seeming occasions for censure unavoidable. I deserved not blame from him who made mine difficult. And you, my dear, had I any other man to deal with than Mr. Lovelace, or had he but half the merit which Mr. Hickman has, would have found that my doctrine on this subject should have governed my whole practice. It has been thought, by some worthy and ingenious persons, that if Lovelace had been drawn an infidel or scoffer, his character, according to the taste of the present worse than sceptical age, would have been more natural. It is, however, too well known, that there are very many persons of this cast, whose actions discredit their belief, and are not the very devils in Scripture said to believe and tremble. But the reader must have observed, that great, and it is hoped good use, has been made throughout the work, by drawing Lovelace an infidel only in practice, and this as well in the arguments of his friend Belford, as in his own frequent remorses, when touched with temporary compunction, and in his last scenes, which could not have been made, had either of them been painted as sentimental unbelievers. Not to say that Clarissa, whose great objection to Mr. Wyerley was, that he was a scoffer, must have been inexcusable had she known Lovelace to be so, and had given the least attention to his addresses. On the contrary, thus she comforts herself when she thinks she must be his. This one consolation, however, remains: he is not an infidel, an unbeliever. Had he been an infidel, there would have been no room at all for hope of him. But priding himself as he does in his fertile invention, he would have been utterly abandoned, irreclaimable, and a savage. And it must be observed that scoffers are too witty in their own opinion, in other words, value themselves too much upon their profligacy, to aim at concealing it. Besides, had Lovelace added ribald jests upon religion to his other liberties, the freedoms which would then have passed between him and his friend must have been of a nature truly infernal. And this further hint was meant to be given by way of inference, that the man who allowed himself in those liberties either of speech or action which Lovelace thought shameful was so far a worse man than Lovelace. For this reason he is every where made to treat jests on sacred things and subjects, even down to the mythology of the pagans among pagans, as undoubted marks of the ill breeding of the jester. Obscene images and talk, as liberties too shameful for even rakes to allow themselves in, and injustice to creditors, and in matters of meum and tuum, as what it was beneath him to be guilty of. Some have objected to the meekness, to the tameness, as they will have it to be, of Mr. Hickman's character. And yet Lovelace owns, that he rose upon him with great spirit in the interview between them; once when he thought a reflection was but implied on Miss Howe, and another time when he imagined himself treated contemptuously. Miss Howe, it must be owned, though not to the credit of her own character, treats him ludicrously on several occasions; but so she does her mother; and perhaps a lady of her lively turn would have treated as whimsically any man but a Lovelace. Mr. Belford speaks of him with honour and respect; so does Colonel Morden; and so does Clarissa on every occasion; and all that Miss Howe herself says of him tends more to his reputation than discredit, as Clarissa indeed tells her. And as to Lovelace's treatment of him, the reader must have observed, that it was his way to treat every man with contempt, partly by way of self-exaltation, and partly to gratify the natural gaiety of his disposition. He says himself to Belford, Thou knowest I love him not, Jack; and whom we love not, we cannot allow a merit to; perhaps not the merit they should be granted. Modest and diffident men, writes Belford to Lovelace in praise of Mr. Hickman, wear not soon off those little precisenesses, which the confident, if ever they had them, presently get over. But as Miss Howe treats her mother as freely as she does her lover, so does Mr. Lovelace take still greater liberties with Mr. Belford than he does with Mr. Hickman, with respect to his person, air, and address, as Mr. Belford himself hints to Mr. Hickman. And yet is he not so readily believed to the discredit of Mr. Belford, by the ladies in general, as he is when he disparages Mr. Hickman? Whence can this particularity arise? Mr. Belford had been a rake, but was in a way of reformation. Mr. Hickman had always been a good man. And Lovelace confidently says, that the women love a man whose regard for them is founded in the knowledge of them. Nevertheless, it must be owned, that it was not purposed to draw Mr. Hickman as the man of whom the ladies in general were likely to be very fond. Had it been so, goodness of heart and gentleness of manners, great assiduity, and inviolable and modest love, would not of themselves have been supposed sufficient recommendations. He would not have been allowed the least share of preciseness or formality, although those defects might have been imputed to his reverence for the object of his passion; but in his character it was designed to show, that the same man could not be every thing, and to intimate to ladies, that in choosing companions for life, they should rather prefer the honest heart of a Hickman, which would be all their own, than to risk the chance of sharing, perhaps with scores, and some of those probably the most profligate of the sex, the volatile mischievous one of a Lovelace. In short, that they should choose, if they wish for durable happiness, for rectitude of mind, and not for speciousness of person or address; nor make a jest of a good man in favour of a bad one, who would make a jest of them, and of their whole sex. 2 letters, however, by way of accommodation, are inserted in this edition, which perhaps will give Mr. Hickman's character some heightening with such ladies as love spirit in a man, and had rather suffer by it than not meet with it. Women, born to be controlled, stoop to the forward and the bold, says Waller; and Lovelace too. Some have wished that the story had been told in the usual narrative way of telling stories designed to amuse and divert, and not in letters written by the respective persons whose history is given in them. The author thinks he ought not to prescribe to the taste of others, but imagined himself at liberty to follow his own. He perhaps mistrusted his talents for the narrative kind of writing. He had the good fortune to succeed in the epistolary way once before. A story in which so many persons were concerned either principally or collaterally, and of characters and dispositions so various, carried on with tolerable connection and perspicuity, in a series of letters from different persons, without the aid of digressions and episodes foreign to the principal end and design, he thought had novelty to be pleaded for it, and that, in the present age, he supposed would not be a slight recommendation. Besides what has been said above, and in the preface on this head, the following opinion of an ingenious and candid foreigner on this manner of writing may not be improperly inserted here. The method which the author had pursued in the history of Clarissa is the same as in the life of Pamela. Both are related in familiar letters by the parties themselves, at the very time in which the events happened; and this method has given the author great advantages, which he could not have drawn from any other species of narration. The minute particulars of events, the sentiments and conversation of the parties, are, upon this plan, exhibited with all the warmth and spirit that the passion supposed to be predominant at the very time could produce, and with all the distinguishing characteristics which memory can supply in a history of recent transactions. Romances in general, and Marivaux amongst others, are wholly improbable, because they suppose the history to be written after the series of events is closed by the catastrophe, a circumstance which implies a strength of memory beyond all example and probability in the persons concerned, enabling them, at the distance of several years, to relate all the particulars of a transient conversation; or rather, it implies a yet more improbable confidence and familiarity between all these persons and the author. There is, however, one difficulty attending the epistolary method; for it is necessary that all the characters should have an uncommon taste for this kind of conversation, and that they should suffer no event, not even a remarkable conversation, to pass, without immediately committing it to writing. But for the preservation of the letters once written, the author has provided with great judgment, so as to render this circumstance highly probable. This quotation is translated from a critique on the history of Clarissa, written in French and published at Amsterdam. The whole critique, rendered into English, was inserted in the Gentleman's Magazine of June and August 1749. The author has done great honour in it to the history of Clarissa; and as there are remarks published with it, which answer several objections made to different passages in the story by that candid foreigner, the reader is referred to the aforesaid magazine for both. It is presumed that what this gentleman says of the difficulties attending a story thus given in the epistolary manner of writing, will not be found to reach the history before us. It is very well accounted for in it how the two principal female characters came to take so great a delight in writing. Their subjects are not merely subjects of amusement, but greatly interesting to both. Yet many ladies there are who now laudably correspond, when at distance from each other, on occasions that far less affect their mutual welfare and friendships than those treated of by these ladies. The two principal gentlemen had motives of gaiety and vain glory for their inducements. It will generally be found, that persons who have talents for familiar writing, as these correspondents are presumed to have, will not forbear amusing themselves with their pens on less arduous occasions than what offer to these. These four, whose stories have a connection with each other, out of the great number of characters who are introduced in this history, are only eminent in the epistolary way. The rest appear but as occasional writers, and as drawn in rather by necessity than choice, from the different relations in which they stand with the four principal persons. The length of the piece has been objected to by some, who perhaps looked upon it as a mere novel or romance; and yet of these there are not wanting works of equal length. They were of opinion, that the story moved too slowly, particularly in the first and second volumes, which are chiefly taken up with the altercations between Clarissa and the several persons of her family. But is it not true that those altercations are the foundation of the whole, and therefore a necessary part of the work? The letters and conversations, where the story makes the slowest progress, are presumed to be characteristic. They give occasion, likewise, to suggest many interesting personalities, in which a good deal of the instruction essential to a work of this nature is conveyed. And it will, moreover, be remembered that the author, at his first setting out, apprized the reader that the story, interesting as it is generally allowed to be, was to be principally looked upon as the vehicle to the instruction. To all which we may add, that there was frequently a necessity to be very circumstantial and minute, in order to preserve and maintain that air of probability which is necessary to be maintained in a story designed to represent real life, and which is rendered extremely busy and active by the plots and contrivances formed and carried on by one of the principal characters. Some there are, and ladies too, who have supposed that the excellencies of the heroine are carried to an improbable and even to an impracticable height in this history. But the education of Clarissa from early childhood ought to be considered as one of her very great advantages, as indeed the foundation of all her excellencies; and it is to be hoped, for the sake of the doctrine designed to be inculcated by it, that it will. She had a pious, well-read, a not meanly descended woman for her nurse, who with her milk, as Mrs. Harlowe says, gave her that nurture which no other nurse could give her. She was very early happy in the conversation visits of her learned and worthy Dr. Lewen, and in her correspondencies, not with him only, but with other divines mentioned in her last will. Her mother was, upon the whole, a good woman, who did credit to her birth and fortune, and both delighted in her for those improvements and attainments which gave her, and them in her, a distinction that caused it to be said, that when she was out of the family, it was considered but as a common family. She was, moreover, a country lady, and, as we have seen in Miss Howe's character of her, took great delight in rural and household employments, though qualified to adorn the brightest circle. It must be confessed that we are not to look for Clarissa's name among the constant frequenters of Ranelagh and Vauxhall, nor among those who may be called daughters of the card table. If we do, the character of our heroine may then, indeed, only be justly thought not improbable, but unattainable. But we have neither room in this place nor inclination to pursue a subject so invidious, We quit it, therefore, after we have repeated that we know there are some, and we hope there are many, in the British dominions, (or they are hardly any where in the European world,) who, as far as occasion has called upon them to exert the like humble and modest, yet steady and useful virtues, have reached the perfections of a Clarissa. Having thus briefly taken notice of the most material objections that have been made to different parts of this history, it is hoped we may be allowed to add, that had we thought ourselves at liberty to give copies of some of the many letters that have been written on the other side of the question, that is to say, in approbation of the catastrophe, and of the general conduct and execution of the work, by some of the most eminent judges of composition in every branch of literature, most of what has been written in this postscript might have been spared. But as the principal objection with many has lain against the length of the piece, we shall add to what we have said above on that subject, in the words of one of those eminent writers, that if, in the history before us, it shall be found that the spirit is duly diffused throughout, that the characters are various and natural, well distinguished and uniformly supported and maintained, if there be a variety of incidents sufficient to excite attention, and those so conducted as to keep the reader always awake, the length then must add proportionably to the pleasure that every person of taste receives from a well-drawn picture of nature. But where the contrary of all these qualities shock the understanding, the extravagant performance will be judged tedious, though no longer than a fairy tale. Finis. End of conclusion, part 2. Recording by Nicole Lee. End of Clarissa Harlowe, or the History of a Young Lady, Volume 9, by Samuel Richardson.